we kickstart this edition of EVConIndia, I, on behalf of Blue Circle, would like to take a few moments to thank all our esteemed partners for putting their shoulders to the event. A special thanks to our main sponsors, Log9 Materials and Hero Electric, knowledge partner, Alvarez and Marsal, for creating the white paper, investment partner, Indian Angel Network, for co-authoring the Startup Ref program, accelerator partner, Huddle, and real estate partner, JLL. It's been an absolute pleasure working with their teams and getting their valuable support. Also, a big shout out to all my team members for working all the hours to pull this off. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, distinguished audience, for joining us, most of whom are CEOs, CXOs, and senior leaders. Many among them are our members and are repeat visitors to our webinars. This is very encouraging and motivates us to provide even higher levels of dialogue. For those of you who are new with us today, India-based startup Blue Circle is the world's first sector-specific opportunity and knowledge exchange networking app for business leaders. It is somewhat like the sector-specific LinkedIn for senior leaders, a space to have meaningful conversations, connect with over 15,000 plus rapidly growing community of like-minded leaders from India and across the globe, exchange high-quality curated content, and access business opportunities across 20 sectors, such as e-mobility, renewable energy, real estate, healthcare, and many more. Those leaders among you who are interested, please do join us. I will share the link to the app in the chat section and will soon be sending invitations to our new guests post today's discussion. Coming back to today's discussion, it's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome today's distinguished panelists who are handpicked because of the think input and the rich experience they bring in. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Nakul Kukar, co-founder and CEO, Cell Propulsion, and Mr. Abhishek Kochar, Senior Director, Industrials, Automotive and Electric Vehicles, Alvarez and Marsal. The discussion will revolve around the topic electrification of commercial vehicles and the impact on trucking industry. Now I request Abhishek to please begin the session. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gautam. So we'll get started. Thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate all of you joining this discussion. Just before we start, you can all leave any of the questions you may have in the Q&A window, and I will pick them up during the course of the discussion or maybe towards the end of it. So in this discussion, our intent is to have a very interesting conversation between two of us, me and Nakul, who is really from the trucking industry, to understand what is going on there and what can we expect and what's the path forward for this very interesting segment of electric vehicles. Now, when we look at commercial vehicles, this is a very important segment and a lot is happening nowadays. Now, earlier there used to be very relevant only for moving bulk goods around. Now they are enabling an entire new business models that have come up on the back of these kind of models. They are redefining the way we live and operate. The concepts like last mile delivery, dark stores, same day delivery, 30-minute delivery, the whole rethink of supply chain is enabled by improvements in the trucking and logistics sector. However, when we think about electrification, when we notice some of the basic things about the sector, we see that there are very large number of vehicles that are that come under commercial vehicle segment. Perhaps highest number of kilometers get also run by these kind of vehicles. They have very unique requirements when you compare them to other categories of vehicles, starting from your ownership to financing to even end of life kind of requirements. Customers generally are very cost and reliability focused, but we still observe that this is a segment which is very important for electrification, but today we have very little electrification. So I think this is exactly what we will discuss in today's conversation and try to understand what is happening there and what are some of the important aspects about electrification in this particular segment. So Nakul, we'll get started, and I'll maybe start with asking a very basic, like 101 basic kind of a question to you, so that everyone on the call gets a context. So, I mean, can you give a context to how does the whole trucking operate in India?
Thank you, Blue Circle team, for inviting me to share my opinions, and thank you, Abhishek, for moderating the session and asking these questions. Let me start with a very quick overview of how the conventional trucking industry has worked. You can think there are three major players in the value chain. First is someone called a shipper, who is either producing goods or importing goods, or someone who needs to ship cargo. Then you have the 3PLs, the third party logistics, the 4PLs or the 5PLs, or even a simple truck owner or a small fleet owner who is hired by this shipper to move cargo from a particular origin to a target destination. And the destination is where the end consumer is, who is going to use that product or is going to use that raw material in their industry or a manufacturing plant to for their own business operations. Out in these three players, what happens is that the first leg of cargo reaching a 3PL's warehouse or being picked up by the fleet owner is, or a truck driver, is called the first mile. Then it goes to the entire logistics network and a supply chain network to reach midpoint, from where it is again going to the distribution centers, and that you can refer to as collectively a mid mile of cargo logistics. A mid mile could be as small as just few hundred kilometers of reaching a particular warehouse and then going to a end customer, or it could be a transcontinental journey from one country to the other before it moves to a final warehouse. And then you have the last mile, where from the last warehouse the cargo is moved to the end consumer. In this high level structure, you have players like 3PLs who come in to manage the movement of cargo, provide warehousing and track the general movement of the vehicles. You have the truck owners and fleet owners who actually provide the trucks that move this cargo, the transportation. And then you have the shippers who are moving the cargo, and the final end consumer who's going to receive the cargo.
Nakul, as we think of electrification in this, maybe I'll ask some very direct basic question on that. So we have seen electrification, taking ground in other categories, like we have seen in two-wheelers, we have seen in three-wheelers, but this segment has not seen much of EV penetration so far. What are the top 2 or 3 reasons you would think are responsible for this trend not being there today?
Yeah, so I would believe that in general, the sheer complexity of designing such larger trucks is one reason why a lot of transition to electric hasn't happened yet. The two-wheelers and three-wheelers are relatively easier products to engineer and design and deploy. So that were like low-hanging fruits with which our electrification journey started. Correspondingly, in the West, you would have seen that initially it started with the cars, and electrification of trucks is something that has started there as well in only last few years. So this initial maturity of the technology to a level where such a high performance product can be built was one of the reasons. Second reason I believe would be the general lack of awareness among lot of truck owners regarding the benefits of electrification. Today, some large logistics players have been able to experiment with electric three-wheelers, and that initial awareness has come in. But if you would have maybe just 5 years ago when we started this venture, at that time, if you would have talked around with some logistics players, they would have had a general idea of how electric vehicle industry is shaping up globally, but how do you adopt or bring that technology to trucking was a question that not many people were ready to answer or could have answered. So this general lack of awareness also, I believe, has been a impediment for growth in this segment. You can see this with some of the large major government policies as well, where there is not a lot of incentives and subsidies available for the electrification of commercial vehicle industry even today. We anticipate that in the next couple of years they'll come in, but as you can see that in general that incentives have also not been there from the government to encourage electrification in this segment, because it's just more difficult and was always assumed that it will happen in next few years or maybe by late 2030s only.
Got it, Nakul. So, Nakul, you made two very interesting points. One around the subsidies part of it, and second is around this whole technical complexity of this category of products, which is leading to a little slower penetration, relatively, at least, if we can say so. I want to go deeper into both of these points. So, if we start with the first point, which is this whole, I mean, when we do work on electrification, and being from a consulting perspective, we do a lot of work on that. We generally define it from a TCO perspective, which is the total cost of ownership. You're not saying that the owner or the buyer in this case is going to look only at the upfront cost of the vehicle. You're going to also look at your overall cost of the vehicle, including your repairs, maintenance, your battery replacement cost, going up to the salvage value of the vehicle, because it's a very commercially oriented decision. It's not your B2C product where you can just buy something a little extra, even if there is no incremental return on that. So from that perspective, what we have seen is that currently the economics doesn't work out very favorable in some of these MHCV category products, which might be very different from, let's say, an electric scooter at the start of the value chain, or complexity value chain. But when it comes to bigger category of vehicles, the economics doesn't turn out to be very favorable. So how would you comment on that part of it?
Yeah, Abhishek, I agree to that. Like for larger trucks like medium and heavy commercial vehicles, which are used for long haul trucking, the TCOs don't work out because there hasn't been much investments into bringing down the cost of those kind of electric trucks in the first place. And that again leads back to that the technology itself hasn't matured to a level where you can first get the initial pilot or a prototype products out, and then you will start building the ecosystem and scaling it. The initial upfront cost of the vehicle is essentially a factor or is driven by two major factors. One is your scale at which you are producing, which in any case is very low today globally for heavier and large electric trucks. And the second is maturity of the support ecosystem, because trucks are not something that can be deployed upfront. They need the support ecosystem to come in prior to the deployment of the vehicle itself. As you mentioned that recycling, servicing, repair, maintenance, financing, all of that needs to be in place along with the charging infra for such trucks to become mainstream. Hence, since the ecosystem is not there and the scale also economies of scale also haven't been leveraged, that is why the upfront cost of these trucks remain high, and that essentially does leads to an unfavorable TCO for these vehicles. The second biggest contributor to a favorable TCO besides the upfront cost of the vehicle is the running cost, and that is a factor on which the large trucks essentially outshine every other vehicle segment, because large trucks will have the best performance or the most uh, benefit in running, because these trucks run the most in a day. They can run up to 300 or 400 kilometers in a single day. And with this kind of running, it becomes really prudent, or it becomes quite obvious that once the upfront cost goes down, these vehicles will have some of the best TCOs compared to any other segment. Having said that, when you look at the light duty truck segment, which is your N1 category, less than 3.5 ton vehicles, which are used for movement of cargo inside the cities, your your light duty trucks and small commercial vehicles for last mile and mid mile cargo deliveries. For them, the TCOs work out today itself, because they are almost equivalent to cars in size and performance, and they can leverage the ecosystem that is coming up now for two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and electric cars. And their running is not as high as 300 kilometers in a day, but on a daily basis, they definitely touch 150 kilometers, which in itself is a very good number to make the running cost also really attractive for these vehicles.
Got it, got it. And you said between less than 3.5, 4.5 ton category and the one above. I mean, is it fair to assume that your view is that an earlier adoption or an earlier penetration levels we would see more in less than 3.5 ton category than heavy commercial vehicles category?
Yeah, that's correct. So the light duty trucks, when I use that term, I use that as an umbrella term for small commercial vehicles and light commercial vehicles.
Okay.
So the light duty trucks essentially can build upon the ecosystem and charging infrastructure that is coming up inside the cities for cars and three-wheelers. The three-wheelers are creating that awareness and also educating logistics players on operating these vehicles. So these light duty trucks can simply come in and leverage this ecosystem and infrastructure that is coming up. Another good thing with these light duty trucks is that they have fixed routes. Generally, they are used to move cargo from a large suburban warehouse or a logistics cluster into a shadow fulfillment center in different parts of a city. So it's a fixed route. Range anxiety can be managed. Chargers can be located in strategic locations, and these kind of logistics operations can be very easily managed using electric variants of these light duty trucks.
Got it. And you made another point around technical complexity of the product, and you also in your other statement linked it to scale. And what I understood is that because the scale is low and people haven't invested so much into refining the technology and maybe bringing the cost down, hence these two factors put together are leading to a higher upfront cost, which is a barrier which industry is yet to cross. And
Yeah.
that's basically a hurdle, which is one big hurdle holding the industry back. So Nakul, I mean, see, trucking is not a new industry, right? And we have a lot of manufacturers who have committed billions of dollars being present in this market from an ICE perspective, internal combustion engine perspective. So the question, and we work a lot with investors in this space, and I mean lot of large private equity funds who enter Indian market or domestic funds or foreign funds. When they look at the market, they have a very simple, basic question they ask: that if the market is on the path to be lucrative, it may be lucrative in some segments. In some segments, it is still yet to reach that lucrative category mark. Um, and you have some incumbent OEMs who have deep pockets, who have been, like, let's say, on top of this market for decades altogether. And if investment is needed, why are they not putting in that investment and leading the way? And this question is not just only at an India level, it's a bit also at a global level, because technology, of course, does transcend borders. So why are the likes of Tata's, Mahindra's, Ashok Leyland's not doing a lot more than what they're doing today to bring down that initial cost, to increase that R&D effort into the electrification?
This is a very common question that is asked of me, like why the larger incumbent OEMs have been so slow in making this transition and what's stopping them. So that actually hasn't much to do with technology and product. I mean, they have all the resources to source best of the technology and best of the engineers to build out good products. And I will also not be able to comment on specific reasons and business strategies of these incumbent OEMs as to how they are thinking or planning this transition in coming decades. But what I can definitely highlight are some of the larger macro factors in this industry, which essentially are the following. For larger OEMs, this is more of a balancing act. They have investments already made in many ICE vehicle manufacturing, distribution, and supply chain. Now, all these three major investments will need major restructuring and modification for electric vehicles, and this is not specific to electric trucks, but even for electric cars or other kind of electric vehicles. And that would also mean gradually phasing down some of their best selling products and trying to build a new product with a new technology, and again facing that risk of launching a new product and seeing whether that is accepted by the market or not, right? A very successfully selling diesel truck and its variant, like say a Tata Ace, and then building its electric variant doesn't mean that that electric variant will be successful. You can see that with Bajaj Chetak, right? Bajaj Chetak was an iconic scooter, but I think it's been already 2 years, or maybe definitely 1 year, since electric Bajaj Chetak was launched, and I think it has a very lukewarm response compared to other electric two-wheelers that came out from Ather and Ola, right? So these would be very these risks will always be there, which will keep the transition very slow for the larger OEMs, where they are gradually phasing out their established products, restructuring their supply chains and distribution networks and manufacturing units to bring in electric vehicles or new electric vehicle products.
But at the same time, is it not giving them a counter risk of disruption? Because if, let's say, I am a new startup or some startup like you comes up and they are able to refine and define the product to the market's needs perspective, and then you are waiting or going slow because you have an existing diesel portfolio, aren't you then in that case trading off your present for future? And I mean, maybe one or two manufacturers may want to do that, where they may not really be uh, walking the path of a cutting edge R&D organization, but will the broader market be, I mean, will all the, I mean, let's say the market leader also take the same position because they have the most to lose, the number one and number two players today. I mean, will it not be like an insurance for them that whenever electrification happens in whatever form happens, at least that volume goes through us?
Yeah. So this is a very valid point, and I would say a true observation of what is happening in the market today, Abhishek. Essentially, because of this reason that there is no prior package, you can see a lot of new players entering the space, and not only the startups. I mean, many conventional tier ones who have been supplying to these OEMs have now started forward integrating into build their own vehicles. Forget about the people who are gonna import batteries, motors, and electronics from China and assemble a vehicle and sell in a local market. You have tier ones who are essentially forward integrating to in a way compete with their customers, right? So this is the disruption that we are going through. Um, the I would say that OEMs cannot do much about it because of the investment they have already made, and it will be difficult for them to move and transition, right? I mean, what you said is quite obvious to anyone in the senior position at Tatas or Mahindras, right? But still they have that inertia to make their organization switch to build electric vehicle products, and that's why you can see that all these large OEMs are doing electric vehicle business under an independent entity, a subsidiary which is raising funds independently. Mahindra has Mahindra Electric, Ford has also built such an entity, Tata has also built a electric vehicle subsidiary which has raised funds, right, and is looking at setting up this entire EV business. The whole reason for this is that they want to decouple their current operations from what they're going to do in their electric vehicle units, because there is just too much legacy baggage that will come if they do it in-house completely in a fully coupled manner.
Got it.
And this is the exact opportunity that their tier ones are trying to capture. New other companies that were not in this ecosystem, in this industry, are trying to capture by getting into this industry, as well as the startups are trying to
Got it.
leverage.
Yeah, Nakul, so if you just still think of this problem, like from a country's perspective, this problem is very relevant, right? There are 2 to 3 million trucks that are there in the country, and one of the users has given us a stat that about 100 billion kilometers are run every year, which makes commercial vehicles the most contributing most to the emissions that we have. So as a country, as our environment commitment stand, and as people of the country, I mean, somewhere there's a need for this to be done. Now, if startups are still getting their act right because the product is complex and it's going to take a certain time and effort for them to reach somewhere, incumbents seem to have their conflict of interest at some level because they have an existing portfolio and they're talking about a new portfolio. Then it gives you an obvious question that what is the role government can play, because ultimately it's government you look up to in themes like this where there's a larger good involved, but not every participant has got the act fully aligned to that good as on date. So from a government perspective, what do you think will be the role of government in this scenario in terms of helping drive adoption of commercial vehicles?
So before I answer that question in a very precise manner, Abhishek, I'll like to, just share some of the comments around how we got started into this, and because they actually resonate very well with what you just said. So when we started out in 2017, and over the years as we have built and kind of uh, committed ourselves fully to electrification of trucking, I would like to just share like the reasons of why that happened. So what we firmly believe is that for India, for a country like India, transition to electric trucks will not only be disruptive or revolutionary for automotive industry, but will be impacting many more industries. Unlike the America or European countries where transport transition to electric trucks or electric vehicles is, their way to start using sustainable energy. So that's their way of, transitioning to sustainable energy. For India, there will be revolutionary impact on many more industries like logistics. Our logistics cost is around 12% of the GDP compared to the West where it's about 8% of the GDP. This will go down as trucks become electric. The current power grid cannot support electric trucks. So, a lot of investment in renewables will happen as electric trucks will start becoming mainstream. And as you rightly mentioned, they are the largest consumer of diesel, the largest source of emissions. So India's fuel import bill also will be impacted tremendously by electrification of trucks compared to any other vehicle segment. I mean, two-wheelers might be the largest in numbers, but their fuel consumption is nothing compared to the what these trucks consume. So yeah, so coming back to your question, given these kind of imperatives where electric trucks are going to impact energy sector, power sector, logistics, and automotive, all four of them are the core of India's GDP. I mean the largest contributors to India's GDP. So government should actually be providing a lot more encouraging incentives and policies that drive or accelerate this transition to electric for these vehicles. I believe that what they have done with electric buses, the kind of subsidies, the incentives, and the proactive effort that has gone, because electric buses were again the lowest fruit in the heavy vehicle category, where you had, you know, uh, a huge number of trucks are similar in performance. Less than 20-ton trucks are quite similar in at least the rating and performance to these buses. So that kind of a concerted effort would be needed, or promotion would be needed from the government side to enable or help vehicle manufacturers and the entire ecosystem to quickly transition to electric. I believe what is happening right now is the policymakers have focused on the lowest hanging fruits, which were two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and city buses. But the next phase of incentives will have to go to more difficult segments like light commercial vehicles and medium and heavy commercial vehicles.
And Nakul, if you have to call out, let's say three things government can do, and let's take example of light commercial vehicles. Let's say that 1 ton category, which is a bread and butter for our e-commerce segment, and let's go till 3.5, 4 ton category, which is the below the high ones category. So, what are the top three things in your opinion government can do? One thing you spoke about subsidies as one, right? So, subsidies is one type of intervention that government can do. What are the other two things you'd want to call out that government can do specifically for this less than 3.5, 4 ton category to promote electrification?
So I believe what they have done for electric cars, where a lot of road tax, fitness certificate checks, and such small expenditures have been waived off for electric. I think that should happen for commercial vehicles also, especially in the light duty segment, because that in itself is a huge benefit for the truck buyers, which are not, as financially as stable as a car purchaser. So these kind of smaller incentives at state level will help them much more, or will impact them much more than someone who's looking to buy a high priced electric car. So this, I believe, is going to be, can be another thing that can happen at the state level. Then on the supply side, where, encouraging vehicle manufacturers to start building electric vehicles is an area of intervention where government can actually bring in lot of support and encouragement. I know they have done it with PLI schemes and ACC schemes. But if you look at the bidders and the winners in those schemes, they have been primarily the two-wheeler and three-wheeler manufacturers and some of the car manufacturers. I think a lot of those schemes and policies need to be redefined and revisited specifically for commercial vehicle segment. And then I think the third most important contribution that the government can make is building out the charging infra as the public charging infra for these vehicles, because the charging infra for these larger trucks will not be cheap. It will be really costly, and I believe that private sector at a macro level also, India's private sector will not be able to make sufficient investments into building out the charging infra for heavy trucks, even for medium duty trucks, just because of the sheer power ratings and the kind of complexity involved in that. So I believe that either in a public-private partnership models or in a purely public charging infrastructure investment model will have to be taken looked at by the government to set up some of these huge charging hubs along highways.
Right. So essentially, you're saying even though the per vehicle charge requirement is high, and generally, I mean, trucks generally park at a certain place and they queue, which technically give you an indication that the utilization levels that these charging points will have would also be reasonably better. Like, I mean, we were looking at some charging data in India, and we noticed that on an average, the current charging stations in the country at an overall level have utilization less than 10% on an average, like 6, 7, 8%, which is not the right level of utilization for people to make money. Now, this needs to really go up
Yeah,
more than 20% at least for the businesses to be viable. But when you think about the same concept for LCVs, and given we can hope that the charging stations that come up will have a higher utilization. So essentially, you are saying that in spite of that, the significantly higher upfront cost is still going to be a barrier which would stop people from coming in and taking it up as an enterprise and kind of setting up these charging stations, say along the highway.
yeah. So I meant that specifically for medium and heavy duty trucks, not for the light duty trucks. Light duty trucks would definitely be able to leverage the uh, infrastructure that is coming up right now for electric cars along the highways and within the cities. So, but when you start looking at medium and heavy duty trucks, their charging hubs will not only be about chargers. You would need investment into upstream power infrastructure also,
Hmm.
because this these trucks will make it mandatory to have extra generation, energy generation, right? So the upstream investments we might go as high, go all the way up to setting up new solar plants or new power sources, and aligning all of that is where government can play a very pivotal role, because if it would only have been about charging infra, I mean costlier chargers and some more land, private players could have done it. But now you are asking about augmenting the grid also by having more distribution center, more distribution transformers, the impact on the transmission side from the generators, right? Even all of that needs to be upgraded or new infra needs to be added there as well. So either a huge, like large power company start making investments into this, or but that will not happen until the demand and the number of electric trucks would have gone up. So those initial investments, when the asset utilization can be less than 20% only, will have to, I believe, will have to come from the government side to
Got
kind
it.
of kickstart or jumpstart this sector.
Got it. So, in your opinion, and let's call these two segments separately, LCV separately and MHCV separately. When do you see genuine penetration would come in? When do you think this will start taking off? And what kind of numbers do you foresee in terms of penetration numbers?
So I think we can take cue from what is happening in the more mature Western markets for the same segments. Um, by 2030, the light commercial vehicle space, the N1 category, less than 3.5 ton GVW, will start seeing a good adoption. I anticipate we would be touching more than 20% of light duty trucks being built in India are electric by 2030. So they will see a good adoption. I think by 2025 we should see inflection point in adoption also. You don't have any major disturbances or unexpected global issues. Uh, but this entire decade for medium and heavy duty trucks, it would be more of an experimentation and pilot programs. And this is where the Western nations are today, the North American and European markets are today, where companies like Volvo and Daimler and Ford and GM are doing pilots. They are putting out 100 trucks or 500 or 600 trucks, maximum 1000 heavy duty trucks, and testing out the waters, figuring out the unit economics, and trying to make the business models work out. So they have been doing this since 2018, I think, around the time when Tesla Semi was announced. And Tesla Semi still hasn't been made available for retail purchase. It is not retail, it's not available for retail sales, and still only pilots are going on. And I think this situation will continue in the West also till 2025. By that time, in India, we will start seeing pilots and some, you know, small size deployments happening with the logistics companies on these large and heavy trucks. And beyond 2030, we will start seeing that adoption or that initial growth in their usage.
Got it. So Nakul, you spoke about these international examples, and like China also you spoke about. Now, one of the questions around China has been China has seen a lot of LNG in commercial HCVs basically. Now, now different governments are trying to look at different alternate fuels compared to your traditional diesel as a fuel, right? So China has gone the LNG way. There's still discussion around what happens to the EV journey. Do you think something like that is a path forward for a heavy commercial vehicle? Or do you think that is not really a relevant? I mean, we'll short circuit the whole LNG story and we'll straight away come to an EV.
See, what I believe is that there is going to be a lot of heterogeneity in the next 2 decades in the kind of technologies and solutions that are coming to the market. Uh, with electrification, what's going to happen is that you can kind of uh, you can target one segment of the market, but there will be some more segments which are much more demanding, and maybe the electric vehicle technology cannot fulfill that. Good example will be 40-ton trailers that have to travel 1,000 kilometers in a day. That is a segment that electric cannot handle. So you might need to go for a hybrid technology or a LNG variant, or even, clean fuels. So your biofuels can come in there, or fuels that have been made by, using more zero emission fuels that have been created, that can be used with ICE engines itself, or you can even have some vehicles using hydrogen fuel cells. So there are a lot of these technologies. Which one gain traction would depend a lot on which technology is making the TCO work out in that particular segment. I mean, if the government's policies become, really encouraging for CNG, then we might never talk about LNG or hydrogen, and we might just go ahead with CNG. That is something we can't predict. But if there are good investments made into hydrogen, and we may see hydrogen picking up, then for very specific application and use cases, you might be seeing hydrogen trucks, right? And this is the kind of I would say, this is not a winner takes all kind of a market. You will see mixture of fuel technologies and energy sources being used. And I would say that this is going to be true within the electric vehicle segment or electric vehicle technology also. Today itself, you have different kind of cell chemistries being used. You have NMC for high performance vehicles, and for luxury and racing cars, you have LFP that is being used predominantly in China and India, and is good for low performance vehicles like 3-wheelers, small 4-wheelers, and budget cars. Right now, people are going one step ahead, where they're trying to bring in solid state batteries. They're trying to bring in sodium ion batteries. They're trying to bring in variants of NMC, where you're making some minor changes in the anodes and the cathodes. So within electric vehicles also, you would see a lot of such variations and mixture being available on the battery technology front. And which battery is good for which kind of an application is essentially going to be up to the customers and the manufacturers to figure out as to that this is the best solution for this particular application.
Got it. Got it. And actually, one interesting question came up from one of the viewers, which is basically saying, is it better to go the EV way, or should we think about electrifying the roads? Now, I know where probably the question is coming from, because I mean there are examples. I think in Amsterdam, if I remember right, they have used pantographs on top of buses, and they are using those for electrification. They've also experimented real-time charging when the vehicles are running on some of the highways. So, and given some of these vehicles may not really have the economics favorable if such a big battery has to be on board, the question I think is coming from, is something like that a viable solution, at least for a few use cases?
Yeah, so I'll just go back to the answer that I gave to the previous question. In the mix of technologies and fuels that we're looking at, you can add pantographs and electrification of roads as well. For some very specific use case in a particular geography or a market, that just might make a lot more sense than any other technology. So that's quite possible. Um, I won't be the right person to comment upon which are those exact use cases, because these all things are still evolving, and a lot of issues and pain points are being resolved, but new problems are also being discovered here. So I definitely believe there will be some use cases for these technologies as well, of how they are getting used.
Sure. So Nakul, I'll ask you a different question on that note. See, when we look at the way whole commercial vehicles market is organized in India, we see that there is a decent penetration of this DCO equivalent model, which is owner model. And this is true for most categories. You can start looking at your commercial cars, let's say taxis. All of these platforms will have these taxis attached by individual owners or people who have a few taxis. And the same has been the case with at least the light commercial vehicles and even the heavy commercial vehicles, where majority ownership has come from people who are, let's say, less than 5 vehicles.
Yeah.
Right now, this particular segment has been quite hesitant to buy these vehicles now, right? And there are genuine concerns from their perspective around the value being high, the risks with an unknown technology. Banks haven't supported them that well during the initial period. There is some improvement though, but there have been challenges. So when all of these things are coming together, right, and this is the basis on which the industry has built its platforms, and that is how they have been serving the demand. How do you look at this in line with electrification, and how will some of this move forward into, I mean, how will all of these people move forward on the electrification path?
So what we believe is that this is primarily just a problem of awareness. Um, we shouldn't expect small time driver owners to be the early adopters. And specifically in a segment like commercial vehicles, where the product is the fundamental or the core of their businesses. They are earning their monthly revenues and their monthly incomes by using these vehicles only. So they will be highly risk averse. They don't want to be in a situation where they purchase the vehicle but they are not able to make their monthly rentals. So we will have to, as an industry, figure out different business models, and also the larger operators and larger players who can take a bit of a risk because they have a huge fleet will have to step up and be the early adopters here. And that is happening. Many large fleet owners who have pan India operations are quite keen to experiment and try out light duty electric trucks itself. So those would be your early adopters. And once a bit of a critical mass is built, like if 20% of the vehicles being sold or 10% of the vehicles being sold annually are electric, then the small owners who own less than 5 trucks will also start looking at this segment, and then you will start seeing that adoption by the mass consumer, the majority of the consumers, that 80% of the consumers. And this is exactly the value proposition of our company. So as a company, we are not just about building the vehicle and making a profit on selling that, because we know right upfront that that is a model that will not work out here. What we do here is we essentially address these exact problems that you mentioned of financing, insurance, charging, servicing, repair, maintenance, and even awareness of getting these electric vehicles out there. As the first phase, we realize that these vehicles needs to be on the road generate data that can help improve the product and generate data that can create awareness among the end consumer as well as the fleet owners. And this is what we are doing, where we are creating these kind of solutions and enabling electrification of commercial vehicle fleets in a highly seamless manner.
Got it. Got it. I'll take another couple of quick questions which have been posted. So one question is, so the question is basically, when we look at this whole trucking business, there is a decent amount of basically non-productive travel that happens, because when you're returning, you might be returning empty, right? So
Yeah.
that is really not a very economically contributing kind of a travel that is involved. So is the industry somewhere thinking of a way of evolving where some of this can be minimized, and essentially this point links to a larger conservation of resources and reduction of all this non-productive effort, energy, time, cost, resources that go in. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, so this would come under the category of making operations more efficient, making fleet operations more sustainable, and there is, I think, a host of technology startups and companies working on this exact thing. You would have heard of Rivigo, you would have heard of there's this one company which does it for long haul trucking also. Its name starts with Z.
But these are more ICE also, right? I mean,
So
this is not,
yeah, so these companies can do that for electric vehicles also, essentially, because this is more about optimizing the movement of cargo and making these vehicles or maximizing their usage and utilization. Lot of aggregators that are in the fleet business are also looking at that, looking at just this problem. For whether you do it for diesel or whether you do it for electric, I would say that there are very minimal differences in the operating profiles, because with electric the only extra thing that you have to plan for is the charging downtime. What that means is that the initial adopters would be the applications or the use cases which are not impacted by that downtime. For example, e-commerce deliveries that we have mentioned earlier also. Most of that is done in a one shift of 12 hours, and then the driver doesn't drive the vehicle again. Like they do a 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. shift, then they go back home, and you will get that overnight charging for the vehicles. So there are some such use cases in which you can with which you can start. Then as the charging times reduce and the charging technology and battery technology improves further in the coming years, we will be able to reduce these charging time to less than 30 minutes. And I think that is more than sufficient for these, to make the operations of electric trucks completely identical to those of diesel trucks.
got it. And maybe if I can add my input to this based on our work with EV and mobility space. So one is, this problem in general is more of the sector's problem, because with EV or without EV, that problem remains. However, like you mentioned, with EV, there comes an additional constraint, which is around your charging downtime. And ultimately, what all players in this space, I mean, see, if you have your economics right, you can have basically your asset utilization, which is right. You can have resource wastage, which is happening because of this inefficiency and control. So one big lever which all of these companies have to work on is improving utilization with an additional constraint around your charging. And charging downtime leads to a few other constraints, because if the vehicle has to be, let's say, down for 4 hours a day for a charge, at least, right? Some may take more. What do you do with driver in that case? Are you going to continue with the same driver, or you're going to maybe rotate drivers because you want to maximize that as well? And then you have charging stations, because like Nakul mentioned, charging stations are going to require a lot of investment. And if the investment has to go in, you're going to look for a utilization there as well.
Yeah.
So as you add all of these pieces of the puzzle together, it does become a complex problem to manage. I mean, it's multi-level more complex than what it was with traditional vehicles. And the question was around innovative business models. So innovative business models have to come out which address a combination of this together so that the overall economics and utilization improves.
Yeah.
And that is when the industry goes forward, because inherently every kilometer that you run on these vehicles, assuming the source energy is also renewable, is going to contribute towards your resource conservation, pollution,
Yeah.
all of those tech marks. So yes, the newer models that have to come up over and above the IC options have to really look at maximizing a combination of your driver management, your charging management, your vehicle management, and in many cases also your customer management. Because if your customer again is not like a same route you're doing every day, then
Even
you
the
need to
customer needs to
get
be
that
educated.
also.
Needs
Yeah,
to be educated
yeah,
on
and
how to change their operating strategies and operational workflow to
correct,
suit to the constraints of electric vehicles.
correct,
And what you have articulated is precisely the problem that we are trying to solve as a startup,
perfect.
of how do
Yeah.
you integrate and bring together all these stakeholders to accelerate the electrification or the adoption of electric commercial vehicles.
Got it. Nakul, I'll quickly move to another question because we only have about 5-7 minutes left, and I want to cover all of these questions. So
Sure.
one specific question that has come up is around the upfront cost of vehicle. And we all know upfront cost is a little high. So maybe I'll ask the question in two parts. One is for a typical LCV. I know there are very limited models in the market, but what is the typical cost delta? If X is the cost of an ICE, what is the expected approximate cost for an EV?
Yeah.
And what are ways to bridge that gap, either through government or, I mean, through other means also, if you can extend it to that part.
So the kind of industry information and awareness that I have right now, the first thing is there are not sufficient light commercial vehicle models, electric light commercial vehicle models out there in the market to give you a sense on this, or to give you an actual factual data point. What I can give you is an estimate. What we believe is that the in the initial phase, in the next 1 or 2 years, the cost of these vehicles could be uh, as much as 50 to 100% more than your diesel variants. So if a diesel variant is at around 6 lakhs, the electric variant can go anywhere between 9 to 12 lakhs easily. Uh, this would be a time also in which a small number of vehicles will be on the road, and the OEMs and the operators will be figuring out the actual real world issues and constraints with using these vehicles before OEMs make investments into scaling this up, and operators and users start incentivizing charging companies to make investments into the associated charging infra. In the beyond 2025, we believe that this delta will stabilize at something like 20 to 30% more costlier than uh, diesel vehicles.
Got it, got it. And maybe I'll also add my thoughts to that, since the question was a lot around how do you take care of the higher upfront cost. I mean, this is a new problem for the industry, and of course, newer solutions are coming up. But clearly, there are 3 or 4 ways in which some of this, I mean, is being addressed. And talking about electric vehicles broadly. So one is, of course, government subsidies. In whichever segments those subsidies are available, they take some part of your upfront cost down to relatively more manageable levels. Number one. Second is around financing, because when this whole electric boom or electrification trend started 3 or 4 years back, the problem was that because banks were not ready to finance. And given they were not ready to finance, they were not able to estimate the right risk associated with these vehicles, leading to them offering loans at a higher rate, or you going to an NBFC in place of a bank, or they're taking a LTV of a lower value, ultimately giving you a higher upfront hit that you have to do. Third interesting models which are coming up quite prominently now are around asset leasing.
Yeah.
And there are variations of that. I'll just keep it generic. Asset, I mean, there are different types of leases and people do different stuff with that lease. But essentially, again, as the name says, it converts your whole upfront cost into a operating cost. And then if you are able to make money, let's say on a month-on-month basis, it makes it a very digestible cost to buy it from that perspective. Okay, so Nakul, I want to ask you 2 last questions before we wrap up. First
Sure.
question is, I mean, it's more for the audience. I mean, are there any interesting global companies you would want to name for people to go and maybe just read up on, study for later?
Yeah, I would recommend to definitely check out companies like Lightning E-Motors. Um, shall I put the links in chat?
Yeah, that would be good. But if you can just give the names also, and in parallel you can.
So Lightning E-Motors, they recently went public. They have for more than a decade have been working in the US to, electrify commercial vehicle fleets. And unlike Arrival, which has created a lot of hype around launching commercial vehicle, and Kanu and Rivian, who are going to build these vehicles and put them out, and have done a lot of marketing around it. These people, this company already has a lot of their trucks on ground, and a lot of these vehicles are already being used by DHL, FedEx, and UPS and similar companies. Another interesting company that I would definitely ask people to check out is just give me is Ideanomics. So they are also doing a lot of work in the US on electrification of commercial vehicle fleets. They, although are dependent, they kind of source their trucks, they don't build their trucks. But apart from truck manufacturing, every other problem or issues that we have talked about have been, being addressed by this company. So, these are very two good relevant companies to check out and learn about, who are working in the domain of commercial vehicle fields. Then there are smaller startups like Highland Electric, which are working exclusively with school buses in the US. And that's all that they do. But what they are doing, their business model can be applied to school buses in India and to employee transport buses in India, which I believe would be the most lucrative sectors for electrification in India after public buses, public transit buses.
Got it. Nakul, so we have a last couple of minutes left, and I just want to touch upon this one last dimension we haven't touched upon. So India is also an export hub from a manufacturing perspective. It is not just the domestic production, domestic consumption we cater to. There's a lot of export demand we cater to countries like Africa, Middle East, and beyond, right? So with this whole EV coming in, what happens to our export story for the country?
I believe that once the Indian, I think right now this entire industry, the entire electric vehicle industry is constrained on the supply side and not on the demand side in the domestic market itself. It's that the relevant vehicle manufacturers are struggling to catch up with the demand and deliver that many vehicles that are required. So I believe that for this decade, electric vehicles built in India will mostly be catered for domestic demand. But beyond that, I don't see any reason why Indian-made electric vehicles cannot be exported to similar geographies and countries in Africa or Central America or Latin America or Southeast Asia. I think one electric three-wheeler company based out of Hyderabad is already trying to put electric three-wheelers in North American market and European market, as per the public announcements that they have made. So there will always be this, I think the Indian manufacturers will always be able to get their products out there once the domestic market demand is being addressed properly.
Got it, Nakul. Got it, Nakul. Thank you so much. I think this has been an interesting conversation. We are at 5:30, quite sharp at 5:30. I'll pass the mic back to Gautam.
Thank you, Abhishek and Nakul. Such an insightful and engaging session. It was a privilege to hear you both, and I'm sure our guests and I have been hooked on till the end and have taken home several nuggets. And also, thank you to our leaders in the audience for joining us and for staying till the end and for sharing excellent questions. Looking forward to seeing you all at EVConIndia offline event.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's indeed been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Abhishek.